Hi, everyone. Thanks for clicking in and listening today for our first Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast, known as the SCC. We'll be having regular roundtable discussions with industry luminaries, tackling trends and sustainable practices within the legal cannabis industry. For our inaugural podcast today, we have two of the founding members of the SCC with us to share a brief background on the SCC, what drives it, the podcast that we have lined up for you, and hopefully what you'll gain from listening. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shawn Cooney, CEO of Cloud Farming, and Peter Dougherty, CEO of Orion Partners. Hi, gentlemen. Thanks for jumping on today.
Thanks, Dana. Nice to be here.
Okay. Dana, it's great to be with you.
Glad to hear it. So this is the kickoff for the SEC. So maybe if you guys could tell us a little bit about it, and then who your target audience is, how it came about, and what we're going to get out of this. And maybe, Shawn, if you'd like to start, that would be great.
Sure, Dana. We're really glad someone's tuning in today. And what we're really trying to do is reach an audience of folks who want to drive the cannabis business forward and are looking for the right information to do that. We need to build the cannabis business based on data and experience, and I think this group will bring all that information or a lot of that information forward, and hopefully make for another year or two of growth in the cannabis business as we grow out the coalition.
That sounds great. Peter, what about yourself? What's your take on this?
So the reason Shawn and I got together was the market needs guidance that's data driven, and guidance in this case means use case and business cases as opposed to more vendor infomercials. And what we decided to do was contact companies that represent each link in the supply chain for cannabis cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution. And so basically what's come together is a group of companies that represent each one of those links or the major links. And what they're going to present is business cases and use cases that drive sustainability based on their area of expertise.
That sounds great. It sounds useful. When you say links to companies in the supply chain,
Yep.
Can you give us an idea of what type of companies will be involved in this and what they represent?
Yeah, so it's data driven, which is the reason it's use cases, and it starts with companies like Cohn Resnick, which is a top 10 tax and audit firm for North America. They have 20% of the multi-state operators as customers in the U.S. So think of them as setting the overview for the industry, and then it kind of goes through the cycle of design, build, then companies that represent the systems that are part of cultivation, then companies that represent the systems associated with manufacturing, and then packaging and distribution. So we fit into that from the perspective of driving data to associate it. Shawn's a vertical farmer, so he's going to be talking about that piece of it. So that's sort of the nature of the coalition.
Yeah, and that's a nice jumping off point too, Peter. You guys, I know both of you, so it's always a pleasure speaking with you, but both of you have very interesting backgrounds. And if you would, maybe just share a little bit, not only of your background, but how you came into the cannabis business, because I know that's not where you started, like nobody does.
Shawn, why don't you go first?
Sure, be glad to. Well, I spent about 20 years developing bleeding edge technologies and implementing bleeding edge technologies in networking and video, the network and video space. And at one point sold off our last company with Peter. And at that point went casting around for, the next new thing to do, and ended up in the indoor agriculture space, or the controlled environment agriculture space. And we've built out an existing controlled environment agriculture farm, and have been operating it for about 7 years, and are in the process of expanding the farm into cannabis and have expanded about a year and a half ago into hemp. And what we found was that there's a lack of real information in the cannabis and hemp space when compared to the agriculture space. Agriculture's got 30 or 40 years of controlled environment experience and hundreds of years of regular experience that can be applied to the cannabis space, and add that onto a bunch of data that we can now collect. And it's an opportunity for building out a great agricultural style business in the cannabis space.
Yeah, and I've seen for the listeners out there, I've had the pleasure of seeing Shawn's operation. It's pretty impressive. So, and Peter, you were the one that introduced me to that, and I know you and Shawn worked together.
The beauty of working with Shawn over 25 years is we've gotten to know each other fairly well in terms of capability. And I think of Shawn as Mr. Inside and myself as Mr. Outside. And Mr. Inside, so to speak, is I get to blame all the crazy ideas on Shawn, and then I go out and raise money and turn them into businesses, right? And so in this case, we did 20 years of tech together. And then Shawn sent me a white paper from some students at WPI. We decided to see if we could get folks interested, and the paper was about sustainability. We decided to see if we could get folks interested in promoting it, and lo and behold, over 6 weeks, we got about 20 companies together who are willing to promote both their expertise and then amplify that content through each other's websites, which is sort of the beauty of that is it's using the power of the internet and the power of many for distribution of content and amplification, which is what this coalition is, which is really fun to be able to do with a bunch of companies that have expertise across the supply chain.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I had worked with you in the data world with some of your other startups, but then we came back together around cannabis. So how did that transition happen?
The transition for me was launching a genetics company that we raised money for, realizing there was no data in the market, and deciding to use technologies that Shawn and I employed differently previously in the tech market, like machine learning, virtual systems, and ultimately IoT sensors in grow rooms to present to growers how to get more out of their existing facilities. And once you're into that space, then it became a simple, how do we help use data to drive the implementation of sustainable practices to support the industry over the long term? And the other thing that I'd point at is this isn't a cannabis only related undertaking. If you go to a letter from the chairman of BlackRock, which is the largest private equity firm in the world, the letter that he sent to his CEOs at the beginning of 2020 was, if you don't have a sustainable initiative, we're not going to continue to invest in you. So lo and behold, all their CEOs came up with sustainable best practices for each one of their corporations. And so this is, a national undertaking, not just a cannabis undertaking, and certainly not just a sustainable cannabis coalition undertaking.
Yeah, that sounds great. And it's interesting that you say that because, a lot of the companies that we've talked to, or at least the licensed producers out there, are at that point right now of putting together sustainable practices and soliciting information from other sources. So I think this is going to be a great resource for them.
Yep, we certainly hope so.
Right. And they're going to have to be putting together these practices in order to go forward, as prices change, as the whole country begins to legalize cannabis. It's going to change the face of the market, and they can't run with their heads down into the future.
Well, and it's interesting you say that too, Shawn, because I know both you and Peter are data-driven humans, and part of the conundrum has been, it seems like, at least from what I've heard, is sustainability is a great idea, but we've got to be able to make money. So it seems like both you and Peter kind of look at this as, no, they're not mutually exclusive ideas. They go hand in hand. Is that a fair assumption? What do you think on that?
I think that's exactly where it is. That you will not be able to make money if your business isn't sustainable. I mean, that's just the way it's going to go.
The lens we look at it through is if you can standardize cultivation, you can better manage cost and be certain of your throughput. So sustainability divorced of the economics is unusable. And it's the reason that we have all the founding members focused on use cases, not infomercials, not vendor infomercials. And those use cases will be tied to the economic outcomes associated with using sustainable practices, right? So it's got to drive. The notion here is you need to be able to compete on a national basis because the state borders are going to go down when federal deregulation occurs. And if you're not ready, all you're doing is running into a tidal wave that's coming your way, and wearing swimmies is not a good strategy, right? You better have more than that.
And I'm assuming that's not very comfortable either. So.
It's not sustainable.
Well, yeah.
It's not sustainable. Well, no, that sounds great. I know you've got 15 or 16 different companies lined up that have already signed up that we'll be doing podcasts
right.
with. I'm excited to do that. Are there any kind of practical insights that you think that listeners will gain from this quickly over the course of the 16 episodes?
I hope that what happens is that what we're doing is showing the market, and the market being, in this case, the cannabis cultivators, manufacturers, and distributors or retail, how to use sustainable best practices inside their own company and apply value and get economic outcomes. So that should be the outcome. And so it's going to end up being 20 companies by the time we launch on the 19th. And that should be what listeners get out of this. So these are experts in the market, both what I call throwaway companies, which are, $1 billion plus market cap companies, and then companies like ours, which are early stage innovation companies that are going to drive this.
That sounds exciting. Well, I'm happy to be a part of it. And Shawn, I'm glad you're a part of this too, and really applaud you and Peter's efforts to get this off the ground. I think it's a noble cause, and certainly worthwhile for all our listeners.
Appreciate the opportunity, Dana. And the beauty of this is it came together kind of on its own, just from the enthusiasm around sustainability and the ability to promote each other into the market. So I'm excited to get it launched.
Shawn and Peter, thanks again for taking time to discuss the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition, known as the SCC. And thanks to you, the listener, for tuning in. Again, in this podcast series, we'll be discussing trends and economic impacts relating to sustainability within the cannabis market. Our first member company podcast will feature CohnReznick, one of the nation's largest tax advisory and assurance firms. CohnReznick is global in reach and will be discussing sustainable regulations within the cannabis market. That podcast will be available on January 19th. We look forward to seeing you soon. Cheers.